When you hear about major European decisions, whether it's sanctions against Russia, climate commitments, or responses to migration crises, there's one room in Brussels where it all begins. Not the European Parliament with its hundreds of elected representatives. Not the European Commission with its thousands of civil servants. But a gathering of just 27 people, the heads of state and government of EU member countries, meeting around a table to decide the continent's future. This is the European Council, and understanding how it works is essential to understanding how Europe actually functions. The European Council is often confused with other European institutions, and that confusion reveals something important about how power is distributed in the EU. It's not the Council of the European Union, which brings together ministers from member states to negotiate and adopt laws. It's definitely not the Council of Europe, which isn't even an EU body, but a separate organization focused on human rights. The European Council is where national leaders themselves meet, typically 4 times a year, to set the EU's overall political direction and priorities. Think of it as the strategic steering committee of the European project, the place where grand visions are articulated and fundamental disagreements must be resolved. This institution didn't always exist in its current form. Back in 1974, European leaders began meeting informally to discuss the big questions facing the continent. The European Economic Community, as it was then called, had grown more complex, and ministers alone couldn't handle the weightiest political decisions. These summit meetings proved so valuable that they became regular fixtures. In 1992, the Treaty of Maastricht gave the European Council formal status and a clear mandate to provide impetus and general political guidelines. Then, in 2009, the Lisbon Treaty elevated it to one of the 7 official EU institutions, complete with a permanent president, rather than the rotating chairmanship that had existed before. That permanent presidency is crucial to understanding how the European Council operates today. Since December 2024, former Portuguese Prime Minister António Costa has held this position, elected by his fellow leaders for a 2.5-year term, renewable once. His job isn't to impose decisions, but to facilitate consensus among 27 distinct national interests. He chairs the summits, drives forward the work between meetings, and represents the EU at international gatherings alongside the Commission President. It's a role that requires diplomatic finesse, endless patience, and the ability to find compromise when countries have fundamentally different priorities. So who exactly sits around that table? The 27 heads of state or government, each representing their country's interests and democratic mandate. France sends its president, Emmanuel Macron, because France has a presidential system. Germany sends its chancellor, currently Friedrich Merz, because Germany has a parliamentary system where the chancellor holds executive power. Some are leading large founding members of the EU. Others represent smaller nations or recent additions from Central and Eastern Europe. Also present are the European Council President and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who leads the EU's executive branch. This mix of personalities, political orientations, and national circumstances makes every summit a complex negotiation. The European Council doesn't write laws. That's a critical distinction. It sets the agenda, defines priorities, and adopts conclusions that guide the work of other EU institutions. When leaders agree on conclusions after hours or even days of negotiation, those texts become the political roadmap for European action. The Commission drafts legislation based on these directions. The Council of the EU, composed of ministers, and the European Parliament then negotiate and adopt the actual laws. But without the European Council's political agreement on the big picture, the entire system would lack direction and coherence. Most decisions in the European Council are taken by consensus, a diplomatic way of saying everyone agrees, or at least no one objects strongly enough to block progress. When formal votes are required, the institution uses qualified majority voting for certain procedural matters, meaning 55% of member states representing at least 65% of the EU's population must agree. But here's where things get complicated and politically charged. On the most sensitive issues, foreign policy, defense, taxation, EU enlargement, the European Council requires unanimity. Every single leader must say yes, which means any one country can veto a decision. This unanimity requirement has become one of the most contentious aspects of European governance. In October 2025, when leaders gathered in Brussels to discuss continued support for Ukraine, European defense capabilities and competitiveness, the shadow of potential vetoes hung over the proceedings. Hungary, under Viktor Orbán, has repeatedly used its veto power to block or delay decisions on Russia sanctions and Ukraine aid, arguing for different approaches to the conflict. This has led to growing frustration among other member states and renewed calls for reform. A group of countries, led by Germany, Austria, and Slovenia, have advocated for extending qualified majority voting to foreign policy and enlargement decisions, arguing that unanimity allows single governments to hold the entire bloc hostage at moments of geopolitical crisis. But changing the voting rules isn't simple. It would require treaty change, which itself requires unanimity, creating a catch-22 situation. Countries that benefit from veto power are unlikely to voluntarily give it up. Smaller nations worry that qualified majority voting would allow large countries to dominate decision-making. The debate reflects a fundamental tension in the European project between national sovereignty and collective action, between the desire for an effective union and the fear of losing control over vital national interests. The issues dominating recent European Council meetings reveal the pressures facing Europe today. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, support for Kyiv has been a constant agenda item. Leaders have coordinated multiple rounds of sanctions against Moscow, agreed on billions in financial and military assistance, and grappled with the economic consequences of severing energy ties with Russia. In October 2025, they greenlit another package of sanctions and pressed forward with plans to use frozen Russian assets in Europe to fund Ukraine's war effort and economic reconstruction for at least the next 2 years. These decisions require balancing moral imperatives, strategic calculations, and domestic political pressures. Defense has surged up the European Council's priority list. For decades, European security largely meant relying on NATO and, by extension, American military power. But uncertainty about transatlantic relations and the stark reality of war on Europe's eastern border have forced a reckoning. In October 2025, the EU unveiled a roadmap aimed at ensuring Europe can defend itself against outside attack by the end of the decade. This represents a profound shift in thinking, from viewing defense as primarily a national responsibility coordinated through NATO to building genuine European defense capabilities. The European Council must navigate questions of spending, industrial cooperation, and command structures while respecting that defense remains one of the most jealously guarded national prerogatives. Competitiveness has emerged as another central concern. Driven by anxiety that Europe is falling behind the United States and China in critical technologies and economic dynamism, leaders have tasked the Commission with proposals to boost innovation, reduce regulatory burdens, and complete the single market in areas like digital services and capital markets. The challenge is finding agreement between countries with different economic models, some favoring more state intervention and industrial policy, others preferring market-driven approaches. Housing policy, migration management, and the situation in the Middle East round out an agenda that reflects the breadth of challenges facing the continent. The European Council also plays a crucial role in appointments, selecting the leadership of key EU institutions. In 2024, leaders chose the new Commission President, the European Council President, and the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. These decisions involve complex political bargaining, balancing geographic representation, political families, and gender balance. The process reveals how power actually works in the EU, through backroom negotiations and package deals rather than transparent democratic processes, a reality that feeds Eurosceptic criticism. International summits represent another dimension of the European Council's work. President Costa co-chairs meetings with partners from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, presenting a united European front on global issues. In November 2025, he traveled to Brazil for the COP30 climate summit and to Colombia for the EU CELAC summit with Latin American and Caribbean leaders. These gatherings attempt to project European influence and values on the world stage, though their effectiveness depends on whether the EU can actually deliver on collective commitments when individual member states have divergent interests. The European Council embodies both the promise and the frustration of the European project. It brings together democratically elected leaders to find common ground on continental challenges that no single country can solve alone. Climate change, migration, economic competition with global powers, security threats. These issues demand coordinated responses. The European Council provides the political forum where such coordination can happen, where national perspectives can be reconciled into European positions. Yet the institution also highlights the limits of integration. Leaders arrive in Brussels representing national electorates with different histories, priorities, and political cultures. A Polish prime minister facing Russian military pressure thinks differently about defense spending than a Portuguese leader focused on economic recovery. A Hungarian government skeptical of liberal democracy approaches rule of law questions differently than Dutch or Swedish counterparts. The European Council must accommodate this diversity, which means decisions often represent the lowest common denominator rather than bold, transformative action. As Europe faces mounting challenges, from geopolitical competition to climate transition to demographic change, the European Council's ability to forge consensus will be tested repeatedly. The institution's informal, leader-driven character allows for flexibility and political creativity that more rigid structures might lack. But the unanimity requirement on key issues and the absence of true supranational authority mean that European action depends ultimately on the willingness of national leaders to compromise and commit. The European Council will continue to be where Europe's future is decided, for better or worse. Understanding this institution means understanding that the EU is neither a superstate that overrides national sovereignty, nor a mere talking shop without real power. It's something in between, a unique political experiment where sovereign nations pool their authority on certain issues while jealously guarding it on others, where consensus must be built rather than imposed, and where the art of compromise determines whether Europe can act as one or remains divided. I hope this deep dive into the European Council has clarified how this crucial institution shapes European politics and why its decisions matter far beyond Brussels. If you're interested in continuing to explore European affairs and global geopolitical dynamics together, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications for future analyses. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of EU governance intrigue you most? Or what topics you'd like me to cover next? Understanding these complex institutions takes time and curiosity, so thank you for learning alongside me.